Imagine a world suffering from sickness because medical developments have not yet been discovered that can cure these diseases.
Imagine a cell that has the ability to regenerate itself time and time again, unlocking a world of unlimited scientific discovery.
Imagine the person that holds the key to these answers is unaware that their cells have been taken without their consent.
Imagine virtually no surviving medical records and your death certificate is one of the only remaining pieces of evidence that tell your story.
This is the story of Henrietta Lacks.
Henrietta Lacks was born on August 1st, 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. Her birth name was Loretta Pleasant. It is unknown when and why she decided to change her name to Henrietta. In 1924, when Henrietta was 4 years old, her mother passed away, and she and her 10 siblings were sent to live with different members of their family.
Henrietta grew up with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks, as well as her cousin, David Day Lacks. While living with her grandfather, Henrietta spent her days harvesting tobacco in the fields and feeding the animals that lived on the property. Henrietta walked 2 miles every day to the schoolhouse for black children until she was in 6th grade, which is when she dropped out of school. Like the rest of the Lacks family, and pursued working in the tobacco fields. Just before Henrietta's 14th birthday, she and her cousin Day gave birth to their first son, Lawrence, out of wedlock. It wasn't until April 10, 1941, that she and Day said their vows in a private wedding ceremony.
In 1941, the United States was in the midst of a world war. Many small tobacco farms were barely generating enough profit to make ends meet. Though the war depleted economic success in the South, wartime aided in creating jobs in northern factories. The Great Migration moved people searching for jobs from the South to the North. Henrietta and Day left their small tobacco farm behind and ventured into the North, where they ended up at Turner Station in Maryland.
While living in Maryland, Henrietta noticed something was wrong with her body. Lacks reportedly confided this information in her cousins Sadie and Margaret, telling them that she had a knot inside. The women poked at her stomach and suggested that maybe she was pregnant. They urged her to visit a doctor to confirm her diagnosis, but Henrietta refused, and just a week later, she became pregnant with her 5th child. After the child was born, Henrietta's pain did not go away, so she decided to inspect it for herself. She felt the knot and urged her husband Day to take her to a doctor.
After receiving a referral from a local physician, Henrietta went to the Johns Hopkins Hospital on January 29, 1951, hoping that the doctors would fix her right up. Johns Hopkins, an abolitionist and philanthropist, founded Johns Hopkins Hospital as a facility which would both accept and care for poor black families.
Because of discriminatory laws in the 1950s, black patients could be turned away from hospitals, doctors' offices, and clinics that served white people. This meant that Johns Hopkins was the most promising facility that could diagnose and treat her condition.
When Henrietta arrived, she was introduced to the gynecologist on call, Howard Jones. Together they reviewed Henrietta's medical history, and she described the lump that she felt inside herself. When Jones examined her, he found a tumor about the size of a nickel and the color of grape jello. It was there that Henrietta was officially diagnosed with cervical cancer.
Taken without her or her family's consent, the cells were removed from her body to be tested for research. Dr. George Guy, cell biologist at Hopkins, studied this remarkable cell, which he quickly realized was out of the ordinary. The cells of other people who had cervical cancer would die. Hers were different. The cells doubled every 20 to 24 hours outside of her body.
Nicknamed the HeLa cell, HE for Henrietta and LA for Lacks, her cell has been used to study the effects of toxins, drugs, hormones, and viruses on cancer cells without experimenting directly on humans. Since the time of her death in 1951, the HeLa cell has also assisted in the development of many medical practices.
In the early 1980s, German doctor Harold Zerhausen realized that the HeLa cell contained copies of human papillomavirus 18, otherwise referred to as HPV-18. It was later found that this strand of HPV is what caused Henrietta's cervical cancer and ultimately her death. Years after his discovery, he was able to use this information to develop a vaccination that would help prevent HPV and the development of cervical cancer in young girls. In 2008, Zerhausen was praised for his work and awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his discovery.
In addition to developing the HPV vaccine, HeLa cells were used to develop the polio vaccine. When Henrietta passed away, polio was one of the world's most devastating diseases. Doctors like Jonas Salk were already aware of how the polio vaccine worked. It was just a matter of testing it. Salk would have primarily tested the vaccine on monkeys. The problem was that the monkeys were expensive and their cells did not withstand the polio virus. Jonas needed to find cells that could survive the polio virus, and he was unsuccessful until he came across HeLa cells.
HeLa cells were more susceptible to the polio virus, but they were almost impossible to kill. HeLa cells became so important in scientific development that scientists at Tuskegee Institute built a factory where they could reproduce HeLa cells. This allowed Salk to test his polio vaccine, which in the past 60 years has been successful in eliminating polio in almost all parts of the world. In more recent years, scientists have been able to use the HeLa cell to learn more about virology. Scientists have injected various viruses including HIV, herpes, Zika, measles, and mumps into the HeLa cell, which helps them better understand how to battle and combat these viruses.
Although the cells have made great contributions to scientific development, the attainment of HeLa cells has caused much controversy in recent years. When Rebecca Skloot released her book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, in 2010, she drew much attention to the fact that Henrietta's cells had been taken without her consent, and that it was not known until years later that doctors were benefiting from her cells.
Lack's family was never informed that her cells were being used for scientific research, and they never received any compensation for the work that had been done. Henrietta Lacks' name is often not linked to the HeLa cells and has been misconstrued as Helen Lane. In 2013, when European scientists published Henrietta's genome online without her family's consent, an agreement had to be made with the National Institute of Health. The agreement stated that scientists would be able to use a controlled database of the genome, but they had to agree to many conditions prior to this. In addition, they also had to give credit to Lacks and her family in the acknowledgement portion of the research.
While many thought that this agreement would have ended a years-long controversy, Henrietta's oldest son Lawrence stepped forward claiming that the agreement was not valid and he was cut out of the process. He also condemned Johns Hopkins University for taking his mother's cells without her consent and potentially profiting off of them. He has demanded compensation for their wrongdoings. Johns Hopkins denied Lawrence's claim in a statement made by the university stating, Johns Hopkins never patented HeLa cells and therefore does not own the rights to the HeLa cell line. Johns Hopkins also did not sell or profit from the discovery or distribution of HeLa cells. The Lacks family responded to this statement with accusations of other private entities that may have profited from HeLa cells.
In recent years, scholars have begun the continuation of Henrietta's legacy. Although her life was taken away at such a young age, she continues to live on through all of us. Each and every one of you has been impacted by the HeLa cell in some way, shape, or form.
Today, a tube of HeLa cells costs about $260, and none of the profit has benefited her family. We have learned through Henrietta's experience that while doctors in the past did not always have malicious intentions, they generally failed to communicate effectively with their patients.
It is important that the world learns the importance of communication between patients and scientists. Like a translator would translate if a language barrier exists, a scientist should break down any barrier between the world of science and their patients.
Was Henrietta's case simply a miscommunication, or did her race play into the doctor's motives for taking her cells? Her story continues to spark debate and controversy. Behind every test tube of cells lies a human story. And
this is the story of Henrietta Lacks.